You thought it would be easy. Teach them to chart their menstrual cycles, they said. Help them learn to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, they said. And then you saw the charts. You saw things that you didn't even know were possible, and you really don't know how to interpret them. Fortunately, I've created the perfect solution for you. I want to share with you our top resource for women's health professionals, how to interpret virtually any chart your client throws at you. This new resource breaks down complex chart interpretation into an easy step-by-step process. It will give you the tools you need to better support your clients. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart to snag your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/chart. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 530. In today's episode, we are covering a topic that comes up all the time. We are going to dive into basal body temperatures. And what makes today's episode a bit different is that we are going to be reviewing a study. And I found the study, it's fairly recent, came out a couple of years ago, and they're analyzing the effectiveness of a wearable basal body temperature device versus oral temperatures. And so there's so much interesting details in the study to dig into. Really excited to share it with you. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So again, the title of these studies always leaves something to be desired, but I'll share it with you anyways. So the title of the study is The Accuracy of Wrist Skin Temperature in Detecting Ovulation Compared to Basal Body Temperature. And in this study, they were actually measuring the effectiveness of the AVA device in confirming ovulation, and they were comparing it to just a regular oral thermometer. And so, like I said, there's a ton of really interesting details and some issues with interpretation that I want to share, some perspectives, I guess you could say, on interpretation. And so we're going to dig right into it. So a little bit about the study. Just to give a background for those of you, most of you who are listening, I would imagine, are familiar with basal body temperature to some degree, but for some of you, it might be more of a new concept. So basal body temperature is essentially a measure of your resting metabolism. And that measure is typically taken after a minimum of about 5 hours of sleep. And once your body has actually gone into this position of rest, after you've had a minimum of 5 hours of sleep or so, your temperature actually lowers to the lowest point in the day. And then as you continue to sleep, it kind of rises a little bit and rises a little bit. So when we're talking about basal body temperature, it is that measure of your waking temperature before you've gotten out of bed. And so one of the differences between wearable devices in general and a true measure of basal body temperature is that the wearable devices are taking an average, they're taking your temperature continuously throughout the night, let's say, when you're wearing it. And so it's taking readings of your temperature through your skin every so often, and then putting it into its computer, essentially, and calculating a bit of an average and then spitting that out. So I would argue that the wearable devices, the temperature is a slightly different measure than the basal body temperature. That doesn't mean that it isn't going to be effective for confirming ovulation, but it is helpful, I think, to be specific when we're talking about these things, because we always throw around terms like, oh, it's BBT, it's measuring, it's the same. But anybody who has taken this to the next level, so I have a variety of practitioners and clients who, after we have these types of discussions and conversations, out of their own curiosity, will track both of their temperatures side by side. So they'll track a wearable device and they'll plot it in their app or on their paper chart. And they'll also take the oral baby T and then they'll compare the two readings. And what I've seen over the years, hundreds of charts later, is that although there is quite a bit of agreement when our clients do that, when they take both of those temperatures and plot them side by side, they're never exactly the same. And there's often a difference even in the temperature itself. And so, I mean, it makes sense if you were to take the temperature of your skin at a different part of your body compared to your mouth, which is inside of your body. Of course, it's possible that one of those temperatures could be a bit higher or lower. And that's what we see when we compare an oral temperature to an axillary temperature, which would be under your arm, or to a vaginal temperature. Typically, we do see a bit of a difference in terms of how warm it is on those different aspects of the body. So hopefully that provides a bit of an insight as to the basal body temperature. And again, if this information is new for you, the reason that we measure the basal body temperature is because once we've ovulated, our follicle turns into that corpus luteum and it starts to produce a significant amount of progesterone. And that progesterone has a thermogenic effect on the body, raising our temperature in a way that we can measure and plot on our menstrual cycle charts. So the basal body temperature does not help us to predict ovulation, but it does help us to confirm ovulation. Because if you haven't ovulated, you're not going to make significant amounts of progesterone. And if you're not making significant amounts of progesterone, you're not going to have that sustained temperature shift that we observe when you have an ovulatory cycle. So hopefully that's a good intro for anybody who isn't as familiar, and also a good review for those of you who already knew that information. So let's get into the study. I mean, this study, what they did, I think is really helpful, because I think newer studies now are starting to track more of the cycle data. I think as menstrual cycle charting becomes more commonplace, they're being a little bit more specific with how they're confirming ovulation and all of those things. So I feel like that's really interesting and a positive about this particular study. So in order to select the participants in the study, the researchers chose healthy women between the ages of 18 to 45 who were not currently taking hormonal therapy, so not currently on hormonal birth control, and who were willing to continue to measure their cycle and their temperatures for up to 6 cycles. They were not currently trying to conceive, and this study took place in Switzerland, in case you're interested in some of the fun facts. They excluded women who had any health-related issues that would potentially affect their menstrual cycles, or if they were taking certain medications or anything that might have a negative effect on cycles. And interestingly, they did also exclude women who had disrupted sleep schedules. So for example, if they were working night shifts, or if they were frequently traveling between different time zones, sleeping disorders, sleeping issues, or even if they were breastfeeding. So that's just some information so that we can get a sense of who was actually in the study. I want to share a bit more about how they set up the study, because this is something that I want to talk a little bit more about. So they had the participants wear the AVA bracelet. They had them wear it on the same wrist. So they always do these things to minimize some of the different confounding factors that could make a difference. And they had them check their oral temperature by using the Lady Comp device. And they had them take that temperature immediately once they woke up. So they were doing both. Obviously, they were doing the wrist temperature that they were wearing, the bracelet, and then they also did the Lady Comp. And they confirmed ovulation using the clear blue digital ovulation test device. And so if you're not familiar, that device measures urinary metabolites. So you would actually urinate potentially in a cup and then dip it. That would be a good way to do it. But that's how they did. I don't know if they specifically did the cup thing, but they had them use that device to confirm ovulation. And so like most wearables, there typically has to be some sort of calculation that takes place, whether it's the device that does it or however it works. Because again, these devices are taking the skin temperature on a regular basis and then spitting out kind of like an average. So for the purposes of this study, they excluded the first 90 minutes and last 30 minutes of each participant's sleep. So they wanted to take out some of the periods of time that could be more variable, like when you're getting in bed and you're kind of rolling around before you actually fall asleep, and then 30 minutes before you actually get out of bed. So they wanted to kind of minimize different disturbances during the phases of time where a person is waking up and falling asleep. And then it says, I'll just read what it says because, again, I want you to like hear that they always just the part about how they kind of sort out the temperatures. So it says temperature data were smoothed using locally weighted scatter plot smoothing. So they have their own calculations for how they're, quote, smoothing out these temperatures. So there's just a couple things. Now, we will talk a little bit more about temperatures. I think that anybody who has measured their temperatures as part of their charting routine will know that temperature is quite a variable measure. And it varies based on a number of factors. It obviously varies based on how much sleep we've had and if we've had restless sleep and things like that, what time we're waking up in the morning. It also varies based on things like travel, or if you are in a different time zone because of that travel, if you have an illness. So there's a variety of different factors that can affect temperature. And one of the things that I always suggest strongly to my clients and my practitioners, and it's certainly one of the recommendations that I get a lot of pushback about, is to, if you're taking that oral basal body temperature first thing in the morning, to hold the thermometer in place for 10 minutes before you actually push that button to get the reading. And the reason that I make that recommendation is because over the years, I have seen that it actually makes a pretty significant difference. And I always say to my clients who doubt this, try it yourself. And the rationale is that when you hold the thermometer in place for that 10 minutes before you take the reading, it allows the temperature to stabilize. And so you get a more accurate temperature. And so if you wanted to, fact check me on this, or if you disagree, you want to prove me wrong, what I would suggest is take your thermometer and, just right when you wake up in the morning, push the button and take that reading, note it down, and then do it again. Do it 5 times in a row, or do it every 30 seconds for 5 times or whatever. And what you'll find is that that temperature shifts. It's not going to be the same when you take it 5 times in a row or whatever it is. And it'll start to stabilize once that thermometer has truly warmed up. So it's of no surprise that one of my critiques of this study right off the bat is that they just had the participants take that temperature right away. And so one of the themes I think that you'll hear as I go through the study is that I think every study, we all have our biases, certainly. And the researchers in this study potentially were biased towards the device and its effectiveness, and very much acknowledging that temperature can be a bit problematic. There's lots of different reasons why the temperature can be a bit of a challenge. And for the record, there even are certain research studies, certain methods of fertility awareness charting that discourage women from doing temperature at all because of some of these fluctuations. But as a practitioner who has successfully used temperature with clients over many, many years, there are ways that we can minimize some of those fluctuations. And one of the most crucial things to minimize some of those fluctuations would be that 10-minute rule. So right off the bat, I'm going to say that because this study didn't do that, I would argue that some of the discrepancies that they found between the effectiveness of the wearable and the temperature when taken orally could be minimized or mitigated. So for me, if I was to do a study, I would actually do that 10-minute rule so that we're actually putting these devices on equal footing and minimizing some of those just general errors that can happen when we just take that temperature just right off the bat, 30 seconds, hold it in the mouth, don't let it warm up. So we'll get back to that, but I just wanted to say that right off the bat. And I also mentioned that they were confirming ovulation using the Clear Blue fertility monitor. And that, I think that when you're looking to confirm ovulation, this is a fairly standard way that it's done in research studies. And I'll note that there was no mention of cervical mucus anywhere in the study. So that would have been the only measure. And so, on this podcast, we've talked about some of the challenges with LH testing. I think overall, it is a fairly reasonable measure, but there are certainly limitations of using when you're looking at LH testing. So the first limitation is that LH testing doesn't actually confirm that you have really ovulated because it is detecting the shift in luteinizing hormone before ovulation takes place. So if anything, it's telling you that you're likely to ovulate within the next 24 to 36 hours, because typically that LH surge takes place about 24 to 36 hours before ovulation. Also, the LH devices are programmed to show a positive when the LH reaches a certain threshold. So there, will be women who potentially have elevated LH levels who will show a positive when they haven't actually ovulated. And there are also women who may show a negative just because the LH levels didn't quite hit that threshold. And that could be because maybe their levels are a bit lower, or it could even be depending on when the test is taken. So for example, if you were to take a first morning urine when your urine might be a little bit more concentrated, maybe you would be more likely to get that positive. But if you were to take your urine test later on in the day or after you've had quite a bit of water, maybe it would be a bit diluted, so it wouldn't pick it up. So you can have a positive that isn't really indicative that ovulation is about to happen. It could just be an elevated level, or you could have a negative because of some of those situational factors that doesn't actually indicate that you did not ovulate. And so as, again, a fertility awareness professional in this field, I'm in the weeds about these details all the time. This is one of the reasons why all fertility awareness-based methods typically rely on more than one marker so that we can confirm these events, right? So the LH testing along with the temperature, or the cervical mucus along with the temperature, or the cervical position, or a combination of some of these main factors. Because especially when we're looking at biomarkers in the body, it's really helpful to have that backup method because there are different factors that can have an effect. So one other thing that I found interesting was because there was no mention of cervical mucus, I imagine this is one of the reasons. In this particular study, they instructed the women to start taking their clear blue monitor testing. So they started encouraging the women to take their LH tests on a specific day of the cycle, and they based it on previous cycle averages. So what it says is that for this study, the test was performed on prescribed days of the participant's menstrual cycle. The starting day was calculated by identifying a participant's average number of cycle days and then subtracting it by 17 days. After this initial test, the participant continued doing the LH test daily until a positive result. So again, this is when you're doing a study, you have to have a standardized way of doing things. So it's not me critiquing that. If I was doing a study, you have to come up with standardized ways to do things. But obviously, if you are basing when this participant is starting to take their test on previous cycles, and we don't necessarily know how they were charting or how effective that was, or if that data was correct, then, and also we can't always predict. Every woman will have a cycle that's longer or shorter than the previous. There's always a possibility when we employ a method like that, that if you're starting to test on a specific day of the cycle, that maybe you've missed ovulation, or maybe you'll ovulate later than that, or whatever it is. So just to put it out there. So again, I'm highly critical, but it's because of my experience in this field. And it's because when we get certain results in studies and we look at that, we look at the study as if it's infallible, we have to, I think, take those results within context is basically what we're getting at. So obviously I had a lot to say about the study. Today's episode is brought to you by Temptrop. I've had so many conversations with women over the years who've had a hard time staying consistent with their temperatures. So whether you're trying to conceive, avoiding pregnancy, or charting for health reasons, Temptrop makes fertility awareness accessible to all women, especially if you've recently had a baby and your sleep patterns are all over the place, if you work shift work and it's hard to stay consistent with temping, or if you're otherwise struggling to take your temperatures each day. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/temptrop and use coupon code FertilityFriday at checkout for an additional 12% off your order. That's fertilityfriday.com/temptrop. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. All right, well, let's get into the results. I've done a lot of pre-information, so hopefully you're still with me. In the final analysis, after they've kind of set everything up, they've selected the participants, they included 193 cycles of 57 women. And they found that wrist skin temperature was, quote, more sensitive than BBT for detecting ovulation. However, it also had a higher false positive rate, resulting in lower specificity. So what that meant was that they found that the wrist temperature was a bit more sensitive in detecting, but they also had times when it would detect, but it didn't necessarily mean that there was a confirmed ovulation. And again, they confirmed ovulation using the LH testing. And so there was a lot of different data points that they were looking at, of course, because they have this device measuring the skin temperature and all these different factors. And so one of the things that I found interesting was that when it came to the actual shift in BBT, they found that the skin measurements had a higher shift on average. So there was more of a compelling difference between those pre and post ovulatory temperatures. And the reason that I spent some time talking about how they had set up the study ahead of time is because I wonder if part of the reason that the temperatures weren't necessarily reading as high is because they were doing that temperature right out of bed without waiting a bit longer. Because what I've seen on charts just consistently is that oftentimes, it's not every single time, but oftentimes when women are just doing that oral temperature right off the bat without letting the thermometer warm up and stabilize, those temperatures can be lower. And sometimes they are so low that you might think that your client actually has some sort of metabolism issue. And then once they've corrected how they take their temperature, it actually shows that it's within normal range. So of course, there's a part of me that feels like in this study, they're saying, okay, the skin temperature was more sensitive. We saw a more compelling shift. The temperatures were on average, in the post-ovulatory phase, the temperatures were on average a bit higher. I would wonder, that's my question. My question is, well, if we stabilize those temperatures, would that result still be the same? The reason that I am so critical is because what I've observed is over the years, when I have my clients taking their temperature correctly, that when they're doing both device and oral temp, I tend toward the oral temp. One of the interesting things also that they found, so they said for ovulatory cycles, the percentage of cycles with a temperature shift was higher on the wrist than on the BBT. So they had different things that they were looking at. But they said, however, the temperature shift occurred almost 2 days earlier on the BBT curves than on the wrist skin temperatures. So one thing that was interesting is they did analyze both curves, like both data points, and they were looking at how the basal body temperature compared to the wrist temperature. And what they found was that there was quite a bit of agreement, especially in cycles that were ovulatory, because obviously if you ovulated, you're going to make that progesterone and your temperature is going to increase. So there was general agreement, overall. But when they look specifically in the post-ovulatory phase, they didn't always line up. So for anybody who has experimented with this, where you have a device and also you're doing the oral temp and you put them both on the same app or on the same chart, they don't always match up. There's often a discrepancy, not necessarily a big discrepancy. It's not enough to kind of throw everything out or to think that we can't trust the information, but there's often a bit of a discrepancy, sometimes 1 or 2 days in terms of when we would confirm that ovulation. And then sometimes they do line up. But what they found in the study, like they said, was that the temperature shift with the BBT occurred, it says, almost 2 days earlier on the BBT curves than on the wrist in many of the cycles that they observed. And so what I have found is that when there is a discrepancy, it depends on the factors because chart interpretation is a bit fluid. You do have to look at the context. So there's not like I can sit here and be like, this is exactly what to do every time you see a bit of a discrepancy, this type of discrepancy or that type. There are rules that we look at, but when we're interpreting the charts, we have to also look at that context and bring that experience and interpret those charts individually. But my point is that I tend toward the oral temperatures when there is a discrepancy because there's less variables with an oral temperature. When you have an oral temperature, it's literally a thermometer and you put it in your mouth and hold it for 10 minutes. Whereas the devices, you're wearing them on various parts of your body. And we do know that there is some degree of calculation and there's often a little bit of differences and discrepancies. So if I was to kind of have that tiebreaker, and sometimes maybe not, because again, there can be discrepancies with the oral temperature. There could be different issues, but more often than not, I tend toward the oral temperature. So I thought that was interesting. And also, there was just more discrepancy between the temperatures in the post ovulatory phase. So they found a higher temperature difference once ovulation would occur, and then also a more significant drop. But I think the interesting part about all of it is that both the BBT and the wrist temperature were effective at detecting ovulation most of the time. So when they're talking about specificity, they're talking about kind of just how the temperatures appeared on the graph and everything, but they were both effective. And the way that they've worded the study would make it seem like, the BBT just isn't, it's just so much less effective. But really, overall, both of these options were quite effective at confirming ovulation. And so one of the stats that they mentioned in the study, they said for a temperature shift detected on a wrist skin temperature curve, there was an 86.2% probability of ovulation. On the BBT curve, this probability was 84.8. So there was kind of like less than a 2% difference, or slightly, less than a 2% difference. And again, they're defining ovulation as the LH strip turning positive. And ultimately, it's pretty good. you have a very similar probability that when you have this temp shift, you're going to see this LH, positive LH within that cycle, indicating ovulation. So I would say, although the way that the conclusion is presented in the study makes it seem like the skin temperature is just amazing compared to the BBT, I would say that they both have their merits. I also just want to read another point that they kind of concluded on. They said, our results suggest that the continuously measured wrist skin temperature is more sensitive than BBT to detect ovulation and determine the fertile window. And I just feel like that word choice is really interesting. They're saying that BBT is used to detect ovulation. So this could be just a very subtle point, and maybe it's because I'm an author and I'm obsessed with words and stuff. But ultimately, I use the word confirm because when we're looking to detect ovulation or to identify that fertile window, to determine the fertile window, our primary way of doing that, at least the method that I teach clients and practitioners, is to monitor cervical fluid changes, because ultimately the cervical fluid is what we produce during the days before ovulation. And because that cervical fluid can keep sperm alive for up to 5 days, when you're trying to conceive, it is the most important sign that we want to pay attention to. And in addition to that sign, or if you have limited mucus or have concerns about mucus observations, you can then also add in checking your cervical position, because when you're in that fertile window, the cervix changes. It becomes higher in the vagina, softer and more open. You can detect that just by feeling it, touching it. And also the LH testing can be used in conjunction with that, because typically in a healthy cycle, you would see cervical fluid for several days. And then as you get closer to ovulation, that LH surge, you'd be able to detect that through the LH testing. And those are the pieces of data that are really going to help you to identify when would be the best time to have sex for conception. Whereas the temperature shift happens after all of that has taken place. And if we're waiting for that temperature shift before we take action, before we have sex with our partners, then we're missing out on the opportunity. And it could, by the time that temperature has risen, that is just not the optimal time when we're looking to optimize our chances of conception. So that's probably just a little nitpicky thing, but it's interesting how they worded it, right? How they're saying like this temperature device is going to help you better determine the fertile window, when really, if we're looking to determine the fertile window and, detect when we're likely to ovulate, or detect those days that are best suited for trying when we're attempting to conceive, the temperature would be more of a secondary piece of that equation. It's extremely important to confirm temperature, because that tells us when our window is closing. So now that we've gone through the main points of this research study, I want to just put it out there. What does this study tell us? What are some of the takeaways that we can leave with after reviewing the study together? So I would say, it is really useful to recognize that there was a significant overlap between these temperatures, like these two different ways of taking temperature. And there were also differences, especially in the post-ovulatory phase. And you may be wondering what my stance is on these devices, because it may come across that I don't like them or think that they don't work and things like that. So my stance on devices and wearables is that they can be an amazing and very convenient way to confirm ovulation. I don't think that whether we're talking about the devices or temperature, I don't think that it's a good idea to rely only on one marker of fertility in any case. So when you're using a wearable, I would highly recommend that you also track your cervical mucus and potentially even look at some of those secondary signs like your cervical position if you're comfortable, because when we're wanting to confirm ovulation, it is best done through a cross-check when we're confirming both the temperature changes as well as the cervical mucus changes. That does give us the highest efficacy because there are fluctuations and differences. If anything, this study tells us that there are differences. There's differences between devices, between methods of taking temperature, and it doesn't always match up exactly to what we are thinking of. And even when we compare these two modes of temperature taking, they didn't always match up exactly. There was often a difference between when the device would show that increase in temperature and when the oral temperature would show that increase in temperature. And again, that is even just more rationale for using more than one method to confirm temperatures. So I do think that wearable devices play a really helpful role for women who are charting their cycles. Especially, it's ironic because in this study, they excluded women who had abnormal sleep patterns, but often it is these types of devices that I recommend for women who have abnormal sleep patterns or during breastfeeding times when their baby's waking them up. Because when we have a variety of stressors, scheduling conflicts, and disruptions in the night, it's these devices that are taking that skin temperature regularly and kind of, calculating that average and spitting it out. It often gives us more of a curve to, less of those fluctuations because it's kind of minimized with the way that the devices are programmed to take the temperature. So certainly I am not against these devices. I think that they can be a really great option. I think that, again, my stance on it is that if you are wanting to get additional information about your metabolism or some of those health markers that we can get information from our temperatures, then these devices don't necessarily give us that basal body temperature. They really are detecting whether it's an average sleep temperature or an average skin temperature, and it is subtly a bit different to BBT. One of the things also that the researchers noted in the study, and this is something that is, to me at least, quite obvious. So the AVA device, for example, is worn on the wrist, and the wrist is not the mouth. It's not the armpit. So when I have clients who use the AVA device, their temperatures are often quite a bit lower than a normal BBT range. So, many of my clients who've used the AVA device, their temperatures are, if we're talking Celsius, in like the 35 degree range or something like that. Whereas on the chart itself, we would be looking at 36 to 37 degree range or something like that. So that's something to keep in mind, where if you are using the devices, I think they're best used to confirm ovulation, but not necessarily to be considered as a measure of our actual basal body temperature. So just as something, in case you're curious what my stance is on that. So ultimately, wearable thermometers are effective at detecting ovulation. If anything, this study shows that. They're just not perfect, and nothing's perfect. Also, the oral BBT is also not perfect. And as we talked about, the LH test is not perfect. None of these tests are perfect. None of these tests work in every possible situation because there's a whole lot of variability and there's a variety of different factors that can have an effect. They do work most of the time. And so that is something that we can certainly be reassured about. And again, we can always use these biomarkers, at least using 2 or more when we're tracking our cycles, so that we can always compare one against the next. So for example, some cycles you might have some disrupted sleep patterns or something weird is going on, or your thermometer battery dies or whatever. And so when you have your cervical position or your cervical mucus testing as well as that, then it gives you a marker to fall back on if that's not working out. Similarly, if one cycle you have a yeast infection and you find it to be really difficult to confirm ovulation with your mucus in that particular cycle, then it's really good to be able to have your temperature to fall back on and some of these other signs as well. So of course, what the study tells us, I would say that the basal body temperature does not predict ovulation. It does confirm it. So, of course, that's a key point that I think we should always remember. And the last point I want to touch on is just about research in general. We certainly have gotten to a place in our culture where we really put scientific research on such a high pedestal that we sometimes forget that the research is being done by human beings, and human beings have their own biases. I have my own biases. We all have our own biases. So when we're looking at data, we're all looking at it through a different perspective. You can literally show people the same data and information, and sometimes they can draw completely different conclusions with literally the same information. So it is really helpful, I think, to remember that and not always look at everything, just assume that if the researchers are concluding this, that would be the same conclusion you would have made if you had seen the data. So today, what we did was we went through how they designed the study, and I shared some of my perspectives on just how that could have an effect. But with that said, I think that it is useful to consider that when these researchers are designing a study, they have to find practical ways to do it. These are measuring biomarkers is not easy, and all of these different variables can certainly cause a lot of unknowns and uncertainties in the research study, and therefore, I suppose, reduce our ability to draw scientific conclusions from it. And so I do respect the researchers. I think it's amazing and wonderful that they're doing these types of studies. I think that they did a really good job to try to kind of organize all of these factors in an objective way. Of course, because of my experience working specifically with oral BBT for years and years, I have learned and implemented strategies that really minimize some of the discrepancies that we know take place. And so my comment on that, obviously, is that if we are measuring the effectiveness of a skin temperature versus an actual oral thermometer, that we should make sure that we take that oral temperature in the most effective way and then compare that to the wrist temperature. So if we minimize some of the fluctuations by doing the 10-minute rule right off the bat, then we would have a more comparable measure as to which is superior. And so my bias would be that I have found that in many cases, not always, in many cases, the oral temperature is superior. And of course, in some cases, the wearable device is superior. It really depends on the situation, the person, and how they're taking their temperature, and a variety of other situations. So I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I get so many questions about basal body temperature. I was doing some live classes for our practitioners recently, and anytime I brought up the temperature question or the 10-minute rule, I always got stopped and asked about my perspective on these devices and how I think it all plays out. So I hope that you enjoy this episode, and I hope it serves as a good discussion on this topic. And I'm thankful that I stumbled across this study when I did, because I do feel like it was very timely and very interesting, even for myself to review and to kind of see those different perspectives. If you're curious about my recommendation when I'm working with clients who have frequent sleep disruptions, such as during that postpartum period when baby's waking you up all the time, or for clients who are working shift work, I typically recommend the Temp Drop. So definitely go check them out. And you can use my code Fertility Friday, one word, for an additional 12% off your purchase. And so if they're having a sale, that means an additional 12% on top of the sale price. So again, fertilityfriday.com/tempdrop. So if you enjoyed today's episode and you can think of someone who would also enjoy it or who would benefit from it, the share link is fertilityfriday.com/530. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I would so appreciate it if you left us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts. I do read all of the reviews, and I am so thankful for everybody who has left one. And I also want to thank Jojo, who left a review just a few weeks ago, and I want to read it on air. She says, "This podcast and Lisa has changed my life. Could not recommend this podcast enough. She is so knowledgeable, and everyone should know this information about our bodies." Thank you so much, Jojo, for this review. I appreciate it so much. It really helps, especially for new potential listeners who want to see what the podcast is all about. So I really appreciate all of you for leaving your rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you're loving the Fertility Friday podcast, then I know you'll love our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. It's a 9-month immersive experience that will completely transform the way you work with clients, allowing you to not only teach fertility awareness to your clients, but to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. Our next class starts on October 4th, so there's still time to reserve your spot. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLive. When you apply, you'll have the opportunity to join one of our upcoming information sessions for additional details. There are no other programs like this offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLive to apply now. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE.